Hi, I'm David Valdez. I teach human geography at Cherry Creek High School in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Today, this video will discuss how independent states are the primary building blocks of the world political map. So, what will we learn? Political geography is the study of the political organization of the world. In this unit, we will study the formation of the modern state. We'll also be dealing with the processes that shape contemporary political geography. We will understand concepts of political power and territoriality. We will look at the function and types of political boundaries. We will learn about different forms of state governments. We'll define the devolutionary factors of the state. We'll deal with challenges to state sovereignty. And we'll talk about the consequences of centrifugal and centripetal forces on states. So, the definition of a modern state. Now, the word state doesn't really mean what you think it means because a state in political geography is synonymous with the word country. Its characteristics include the following: a state has spatial extent. It also has a permanent population that lives inside of the area and defined borders. A state has a sovereign government, which means that no other government in the world can tell that government what to do. And a state has recognition politically from other states around the world. The evolution of the modern state happened in the last couple hundred years. Early political states were not well defined. Political power was usually based on relationships between a leader and a group of people, or a king and their subjects, not on the fact that the people were part of a larger country. The people living in that state were loyal to the king and not the country, which meant that they had problems dealing with the king and seeing themselves as citizens of a country. Borders were often unclear, they were poorly defined, and they changed often. In the late 1700s, the European political philosophers created the modern state concept. At this point in time, people started moving away from their allegiance to a single person, and they owed their allegiance to a state and to the other citizens of the state. Borders were drawn to formalize the divisions between the countries, and so now people knew where the borders ended and where they began. And European countries imposed these divisions on areas around the world as they colonized them. So, in areas that did not follow the definition of a state, the Europeans created states for them. When we look at the number of states in the world, there were only about 35 modern countries when the United States declared its independence. That was right around the very beginning of the modern state concept. By the start of World War II, which was about 150 years later, there were about 70 modern countries, or double what they had in 1776. But after World War II, a lot of the colonies gained their independence in a process that we call decolonization, and those colonies became countries themselves. A second round of countries came about after the Cold War in 1991. A lot of countries gained independence as some large countries like the USSR or some Eastern European countries like Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia broke up into smaller countries. And currently, the United States recognizes 195 states, but there are several more areas who would like to become states and get their independence and join the international community. So let's practice. Taiwan is an island off the coast of the People's Republic of China. The government of Taiwan is recognized by the international community to be the legitimate government of China from 1950 until 1971. But after 1971, the legitimate government of China was considered to be the People's Republic of China inside of Beijing. Taiwan was included in that process, and Taiwan became part of China. Currently, Taiwan is considered to be a renegade province by the Chinese government. Your task is to identify 3 characteristics of a modern state that Taiwan possesses. You need to identify 2 characteristics of a modern state that Taiwan does not possess, and then you should explain 2 measures Taiwan would have to take in order to be considered a modern state. You might want to pause this video and have this discussion right now. All right, we're back. 3 characteristics of the modern state that Taiwan possesses is that Taiwan does have a spatial extent. It's an island, and because it's an island, it also has defined borders. So that's pretty easy for us to see. And Taiwan does have a permanent population as people live there all year round. The characteristics that Taiwan does not possess is that it is not sovereign anymore. Taiwan does not have sovereignty. It is part of the larger People's Republic of China, and because of that, it is not considered a modern state. The other characteristic that Taiwan does not possess is that very few countries actually recognize Taiwan as a country anymore. And so most countries, even the United States, consider Taiwan to be part of the People's Republic of China. What Taiwan would need to do in order to be considered a modern state is that they would have to gain their sovereignty. Maybe they would have to declare independence from the People's Republic of China and try to gain recognition, which is the second thing that they need to do, from other countries, especially an organization like the United Nations. Once those 2 things are met, then Taiwan would be considered its own country. So what should we take away from this? Well, the world is divided up into many different countries, and the concept of the modern state was created and spread by Europeans. It is the dominant political form across the world. The number of states in the world has increased greatly over the past 200 years, and it's constantly changing from 35 to 70 to 195. And of course, we're constantly adding new countries as time goes on. Most recently, we've seen countries like South Sudan or even Kosovo or other countries have been added to the world's number of recognized states. It's important that you guys understand that it's your job as a geographer to study the political trends and patterns and processes that create new states and destroy old states. Currently, there are a couple of very prominent independence movements in places like Catalan in Spain or even Scotland in the United Kingdom, where people have been working on trying to gain their independence from the larger country. Thank you. Hi, I'm David Valdez, and I teach high school at Cherry Creek High School in Greenwood Village, Colorado. Today's video will discuss types of political entities, including nations, states, nation-states, stateless nations, multinational states, multi-state nations, autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. So, what are we going to learn? While the state is the basic building block of the world map, there are several different types of political entities in the world. Among them are states, nations, nation-states, stateless nations, multinational states, multi-state nations, semi-autonomous regions, and autonomous regions. Last video, we went into the definition of a modern state. So let's go ahead and review what a modern state is. The modern state is actually a word that is synonymous with country. Its characteristics include the fact that it has a spatial extent. A state also has a permanent population living inside of the area. It has defined borders. A state has a sovereign government. And a state has recognition from other states. Normally, when we think of states, we think of something like Texas or Colorado or even California. But in this particular video, we need to understand that a state is actually a country and not a political subdivision of that country. Nation is not exactly what you think it is either, because a nation is not a country. A nation is actually a group of people, and that group of people has a shared similar culture. They also have a historical attachment to an area or homeland, and they seek some sort of degree of political control over that homeland. A national group is something that's very important to culture and region as a part of this political geography unit. So when you start to combine the two, you get a nation state. And a nation state is an area where the borders of the national group's homeland coincide with the borders of the state. The population is linked together through common culture and history. So nation states tend to be small or somewhat isolated, but it is important for you to understand that of all the national groups that are out there, this is the preferred form for national groups. Really good examples would include Japan and Iceland, where in Iceland, for example, nearly everybody has the same heritage, the same language, the same culture. And because they're on an island, they are isolated from everyone else and they're able to govern themselves. A stateless nation is a national group that's spread out over several different states. So, what this really means is that you have a group of people where they are a minority group in each state where they reside. This means that they have very little political power in each of those states. And as a result, they're not able to organize or even try to become a nation state themselves. Best examples of this are the Kurds who live in the Middle East and Palestinians who also live in the Middle East. A multinational state is a country where we have several national groups inside of their borders. This is probably the most common form of state entity because there are very many national groups, but there are actually very few states. So essentially what happens is that you get one group that's dominant, and that group controls the political, the economic, and the social power. Good examples of this include places like Canada, where there are several national groups, including the Quebecois, the Canadians, as well as several First Nations group. Also, Russia, with its large area, has a lot of different national groups that are inside of it, and each of those groups has their own homeland and speaking their own language and having their own traditions and customs. A multi-state nation is where we have that national group homeland, and that national group actually controls a state, but also spreads its borders into, or the national group actually spreads across its borders into other states as well. The national group is able to control the political and economic and social power in its own country, but it also has influences in other countries. Very good examples of this include Germans, Koreans, where you have one group of people who speak the same language and have the same culture, but they're spread out essentially over two different countries, North and South Korea, and Hungarians. Autonomous and semi autonomous regions are defined areas that are inside of the state. Now, they are autonomous because they're given a moderate degree of self government and freedom to govern themselves. So, the amount of freedom that each of these areas has is going to determine whether or not they are semi autonomous or autonomous. So, a good example of semi autonomous regions are places like Hong Kong, which is given its own government by the Chinese, but the Chinese insert themselves when things go wrong. Also, Macau, which is another small little area outside of inside of China, I'm sorry, that has a Portuguese population, and they are able to govern themselves to a limited extent. Autonomous regions have a high degree of self-government and freedom to govern themselves. So the best examples of these are Native American reservations in the United States. Native American reservations do not have to follow the laws of the state that they're in, and they have their own government, tribal government, and they have their own tribal police, and they do almost everything for themselves with limited input from the national government. Other examples include the Cook Islands and Niue, which are parts of autonomous regions of New Zealand. So let's practice. Here's a free response question from one of the earlier tests taken for the AP Human Geography test. A, define the following concepts as they are used in political geography. Nation, state, nation-state. For each of these concepts, name a specific 20th century, late 20th century example from region A and a specific late 20th century example from region B on the map on the left. So the definition of a nation is a group of people who have a similar culture and an attachment to a homeland, who are seeking to have some sort of independence or some sort of sovereignty. A state is a country. It has defined borders, it has a permanent population, and it has sovereignty and recognition from other states. And so it is considered to be a country. A nation state is when the national group's homeland, the boundaries of that national group homeland coincide with the boundaries of a particular country. For each of these concepts, for example, in region A good example of a nation would be the Catalonians. It's a group that you've seen in the past, and in case you guys were wondering, it is the group that is featured on the illustration in the slide before. A good a good example of a 20th century example of a state is any one of these countries that are there, because every country is actually a state. So you could have picked any one of these from Italy to Portugal to Norway to Russia. And an example of a nation state would be something like probably a small area like Slovenia or Denmark, or one of the really small homogeneous countries that we find there. In region B, a good example of a nation would be the Kurds. The Kurds are a national group, and so they have their own homeland. They just don't have their own sovereignty. A good example of a state would be something like Saudi Arabia or Yemen, or even Iran or Iraq. And a good example of a nation state would be Israel. So, what should we take away? Well, there are several different types of political entities. While the world has fewer than 200 countries, there are several hundred national groups. Many of those national groups are trying to gain their freedom to become nation states. Understanding the role nationalities play in the politics of creating new states and breaking down established states and governing states is crucial to our study of political geography. Thank you for your time.